But tonight, of course, we are here to listen to Dan talk about his story and his family story. And I'm honored to welcome Dan to speak tonight. I met him spring of last year, so I've known him for a little while, and I've been impressed by him ever since. And I'm very happy he's going to be finishing out his HGE COGS, correct? This right after, this semester. Great. This talk will be about the journey of Dan's family from Nazi Germany to Shanghai. It's as described in his great aunt's book, Once My Name Was Sara. My graduate students had to read it for this session, so they'll have lots of questions, I'm sure. And it will expand upon her book as well as discuss the history of the 20,000 Jews who found refuge in Shanghai. So Dan is a student in Holocaust and Genocide education, I already told you that, and he's currently working as a high school social studies teacher in New Jersey, and he's the grand-nephew of Holocaust survivors and an aspiring Holocaust educator. So without further ado, I want to welcome, please help me welcome Dan to the podium. And typically I'm very bad with technology, but that was a pretty smooth transition, I must say. We will also, after Dan gets done, we will open it up to questions from the audience, okay? So, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I see a lot of my friends and family, my fellow classmates, and some new friends. So I'll be 100% honest, my notes and everything did not somehow make the trip here, so I'm going off the noggin, right? So, but it's a story I know pretty well, so I'm really excited to share it with you. So the title is Refuge in Shanghai, the story of my family. That's a me. Yeah, I love this. First, I want to do some acknowledgements. Obviously, my great Aunt Betty, everything is right based off of her work. My grandmother Edith, unfortunately both have passed, but I tried to get as much stories as I could. My Aunt Holly, who's kind of also carried along the mantle. A lot of the questions I had, I was able to ask her. A lot of photographs you'll see are things that she gave me. Two of Betty's daughters, Jennifer and Sandy, they've been instrumental in helping me as well, kind of put things together. Rachel Serrati, who is a Holocaust author and actually has written about her own grandmother. I've had talks with her, kind of giving me pointers and stuff to kind of help out. Obviously want to acknowledge Professor Jody Russell Manning for giving me this opportunity. And then my other professor, Jennifer Rich, for helping to guide me through this as well. And this is the book, Once My Name Was Sara. I think a lot of you have read it. If you haven't, don't worry. I will reference a lot of things in the book, but I'll also explain them, so if you have not read it, you won't feel left out. So these are our main characters almost. So this is my grandmother, Edith Faris, Nee Cohn. This is Aunt Betty, Betty Cohn, Betty Grabeshikoff. And then my great-grandfather, Max Cohn, and my great-grandmother, Olga Cohn Nee Mueller. So these are kind of the main characters, if you will, of this story. I'm going to be talking a lot about pretty much Betty's journey because that's what she wrote, but I'll kind of intertwine my grandmother in as well because they were experiencing a lot of the same things. My grandmother didn't really write about it too much, so most of the stories that we have come from Aunt Betty. So we're going to start back in World War I. Look at this dapper young man. This is my great-grandfather, Max, back when he was probably 19 or 20. So he was one of approximately 100,000 Jews to fight for the German army in World War I. He was, I did a little research on these, he was a private. This is a specialist, so I don't know what he did exactly, but he was good at it. So he actually got commendation for his job. And he's got awards for bravery and meritorious service. Now, why is this important? Max, along with the other 100,000 Jews who fought, they were veterans of the First World War. They fought for Germany, for their country. And once the Holocaust hit, this gave them a false sense of security, right? They were thinking, well, I fought for this country. There's no way that I'm gonna have my rights taken away or anything like that. So that's kind of, luckily, as you'll find out, right, Max was pretty sharp. It's one of the reasons I'm here and some of my family are here. He was a pretty sharp tack, so we'll get into that further on, but kind of just laying the groundwork of a lot of the Jews that fought in World War I. Okay, so life before 1933. Again, Max and my great-grandmother Olga, they met and married in the same year. So it was quick. They fell madly in love. They got married. This is Max's father and Olga's father. Seeing them off out of the church. Life was pretty good, right? They had at this point, there wasn't really that much discrimination against Jews. There wasn't high anti-Semitism. So they were able to enjoy life. This was a picnic that they went. So again, a lot of these are just family photos. So this is Max, Olga, Max's parents, and two of Max's brothers. Unfortunately, as we go through, you'll see, right, we're gonna lose some people in the Holocaust. Max is unfortunately gonna lose both his parents, both his brothers, and it's just gonna be very few that get out and survive. So as the Nazis came to power, there was more and more restrictions. They, started taking away rights from Jews. They couldn't own businesses. They weren't allowed to mix marriages. And they were all issued Fremdenpasses. Fremdenpass is basically a foreigner's passport. It's a stateless ID. Now, Max, and I don't have the exact story for it, but Max actually had his for a while. He was stateless even before the Nazis came to power. So you can kind of see he's got these older stamps of like the German kingdom. Olga had her rights kind of taken away as the Nazis came to power. So that's where you see these, right, the Nazi eagle stamps come in. They were issued to any non-Germans that were living in Germany, but right, they were mostly used as a tool to track where Jews came and went. And I was really trying to read and decipher, but it was kind of hard to see what they're writing. So, and then the big thing that came, this is why the book is called Once My Name Was Sara. The Germans made it law that all Jews with, I don't know how to say it, but like non-Jewish sounding names had to change their middle name to either Sara if they were women or Israel if they were men. And this was another way of documenting and making sure that they kind of knew who the Jews were and they could keep track of them. So the title of the book, Once My Name Was Sara, is because Betty had to change her middle name to, we call her Betty, but her actual name is Ilsa, but Betty was kind of her nickname. But her name became Ilsa Sara Cohn. So the Sara and Israel combined with Kristallnacht, which those not familiar was the kind of German-inspired riots where they were busting synagogues, lighting things on fire, breaking down Jewish businesses, beating Jews in the street. That really set off alarm bells for a lot of Jews. In fact, I remember Aunt Betty would often say anytime that she heard broken glass, if we're at dinner and something drops a glass, she would be transferred like instantly back to that night of Kristallnacht and walking down the street, stepping on the broken glass. So the family kind of had an idea that they needed to get out. So they started to look for ways out. Edith and Betty were actually signed up for the Youth Aliyah, which was a kind of way to get children out. You might have heard Kindertransport. It's something slightly different, but it was to the British-controlled Palestine, which is modern-day Israel. One of their cousins had actually made that trip already, and he is one of the few of their cousins that did survive the Holocaust because he was able to get out and make his new life in Israel. They were getting ready to go. They were excited, right? They were kids at this time, Edith and Betty were, and they kind of looked at it as a vacation. They're like, oh, we're going to get to go, it was kind of like this pioneer spirit. We're going to get to go camp, and we're going to get to go, farm and be out in the sun and play. And so they kind of had this like childlike innocence. They didn't really understand everything that was going on around them. But their mother ultimately didn't want them to go. She didn't want to break the family up, and so they were not able to go to this trip. Max had a line on South America. Max was a traveling salesman and a very successful one, so he traveled all throughout Europe. So this is pretty crucial to, I think, the reason why he survived, is that he was used to traveling around. He was used to making connections. He knew how to get around places. So he had a line on a trip to South America. That ultimately fell through. We can kind of see clocks ticking. He's feeling the pressure. So he really has to figure out what to do with his family and keep them safe. They had an uncle, Uncle Ernst. He escaped to England. And then another one of their cousins, also named Ilsa, went to England on the Kinder transport. Some of you guys might have heard of that. That's where a bunch of Jewish children were basically rescued and sent to England to be adopted by English parents. Ooh. Maybe I ran out of battery. So where were they able to go? Shanghai. Shanghai was one of the only places that they could travel without a passport, a visa, or a sponsor. It was hard to book passage because it was one of the few remaining ports. It was in a lot of high demand in order to book. So when Max initially went, he filled out the application, tried to get tickets, and they said it was going to be a 3-month wait. So he said, okay, put me on the list. 3 months will go by and we'll be fine. About a few weeks later, he gets a summons from the Gestapo to report to the Gestapo office for an undisclosed reason, right? And that's kind of sends a chill down his spine, right? He doesn't think anything good is going to come out of it. So what he does, he goes back to the office where he tried to book passage. He goes to the clerk and says, "Can you review my application?" Clerk says, "Okay." What Max had done is slip $500 into the application, basically all their savings, slid it to the clerk. I swear, it's like something from a movie, right? Folds it up, slides it down. Clerk opens up, says, "You know what? We have 2 cabins that just opened up." So they were able to leave the day before he was supposed to report to the Gestapo office. All right, so I said he's a pretty smart guy. He's resourceful. This is their ticket. You see Max, Olga, Edith, and Ilsa, aka Betty, on their tickets. They also left with their Aunt Lishy, who is called Alice, but they called her Lisy, and Uncle Erwin, and Pipifax, who was their parakeet. Now, Aunt Betty liked to write the book. She was very funny, and which is kind of weird when you're reading about like a somewhat serious topic like this. But she wrote in their book that they also had a parakeet named Casimir. And I forgot to mention it. This was in my notes, so I might be hopping back every now and then. As the Nazis were getting into power, there was less and less people that interacted with the Jews. Friends that had been their schoolyard friends for years, all of a sudden stayed away from them. They didn't want to be near them. They didn't want to associate with them. They even started calling them names, right? So people started to make distance from the Jews. They didn't want to be around them. When it was time for them to leave, they really wanted to bring their parakeet, Casimir. but they couldn't. I don't know how Aunt Lucy and Uncle Erwin got away with taking theirs, but they eventually had to give it to one of their German neighbors. They gave their parakeet to their German neighbors, and Aunt Betty said, it's funny that they didn't care that Casimir was Jewish. They booked passage on the Japanese crew liner Kashimi Maru, nice little 10,000-ton ocean liner. And again, in the book she writes it was kind of like a cruise for them. They were children, so they didn't really know too much about what was happening. They noticed that their parents were nervous and that their parents were stressed. But she writes a lot about the food that they ate, when they discovered that there was a pool on board, sun tanning. My grandmother actually wrote a journal that part of it made it into the book. And it's just really about the food, right? She mentioned a lot about the food they were eating. The cruise liner itself actually sunk a few years after it dropped them off. So there's little moments in here where it's like just luck, right? The cruise liner was actually sunk a couple years after it dropped them off by an American submarine. It had been co-opted by the Japanese at that time, so it was an active military, but just a little nugget in there. So this is the journey. So I actually got this. This is from the Center of Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education in Brookdale Community College. This is not their family, but the journey that they took is pretty much the same. So they took a train from Germany to Italy, left the harbor in Italy, went through Egypt, down to Bombay. They also stopped in Sri Lanka, Singapore, Hong Kong, made it to Shanghai. The trip took 30 days. Their mother was seasick pretty much the whole time. And I can't remember if it was Betty or Edith, but one of them was also seasick. Their father, and I think it was Betty, was fine. I think Edith was seasick. I can't quite remember. But yeah, so very long journey, treacherous journey, right? You're halfway around the world into a completely new foreign place. And so this is my grandmother's passport. And I'm going to point out a few things on here. So we can see, right? It had to be stamped off by the Nazi officials. So we have a lot of these Nazi eagle stamps. But then I was looking through and I was actually looking at all these visa stamps that they had or passport stamp that they had. So Colombo, that is the port in Sri Lanka. Sorry, this is a weird angle. I believe there's Naples somewhere. You guys can probably see them. Yeah, Naples up here. And then you also see, and it's kind of hard to see because this button's right here, but Edith Sara. And her actual middle name was Inga. Yeah, this is obviously a copy of it, but we have the real one. And the first time I saw it, Aunt Holly showed it to me. The first time I saw it, it was just wild, right? You have this piece of history, just like sitting in your hands. So a little bit about, take a break a little bit from her story, and just some kind of general Shanghai history. So in 1843, Great Britain defeated China in the First Opium War and declared Shanghai an open city, open port city. Politically, it was divided by three sections: the Chinese, which was down here, the International, which was the British and American, which were, I believe, Northern, Eastern, and the Western was the British, the American, and then the French settlement down here. So they all had their own, basically, laws. They had their own police forces, courts, everything like that. By the 1930s, it became one of the largest port cities, one of the largest ports in the world, had a population of about 4 million people. In 1937, which is when the Japanese started their wars in Asia, the Sino-Japanese War, Japan did control Shanghai. They were kind of hands-off though. They controlled the country, they controlled the city, but they kind of let these three kind of governments act on their own. And then you just see that's a map of Shanghai. So Shanghai Jewish history. So in the late 19th century, Sephardic Jews from Baghdad made their way over to Shanghai. There was about 500 to 600 of them. Most of them were very wealthy. They were merchants. They had a lot of money. So they kind of laid the groundwork of Jewish life in Shanghai. Once the other Jews started influxing, a lot of the infrastructure that was set up for them was by these Sephardic Jews. And I point out Sir Horace Kadori. The Kadoris were a very famous Jewish family in Shanghai. He set up the Jewish Youth Association School, which is actually where Edith and Betty went to school. In the early 1900s, Ashkenazi Jews fled from Russia. There was almost 4,000 of them. Not only were Ashkenazi Jews fleeing, but just non-Jewish Russians were fleeing. A lot of Bolsheviks, the anti-communist forces, after Lenin had taken power, they started fleeing to Shanghai, and that will come up a little bit later. And then in the 30s, German and Austrian Jews flee the Nazis. About 20,000 of them make their home in Shanghai. And then this is just one of the oldest synagogues in Shanghai, or the oldest ones that is still there. So that's still in Shanghai. So their first years in Shanghai. In the book, one of the first things I notice is that it's hot and humid, right? It is a completely different climate. There are people everywhere. There's rickshaws going by, there's beggars, there's people selling the wares. I've never been to China, but I kind of feel like it might be a huge culture shock, even now, right? When we have internet, we kind of have an idea of what we're getting into. This was completely different for them. It was a whole new world. So they spent their first year just moving around a lot. They went from a one-room house on Seward Road to a property on Ford Lane where they actually, Olga and Max rented it out. They were kind of in charge of renting it out for tenants. That went under because a lot of their tenants weren't able to pay. And then they rented rooms at 69 McGregor Road. So you see this is them. That's Edith, Olga, Max, Betty, and then their aunt and uncle. I don't know where the parakeet is. Probably in its cage somewhere. So I said that the Japanese kind of stayed hands-off. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese ferociously expanded all throughout Asia, starting to build up their empire, and they started to take more and more control of Shanghai and China. They decided that all of the Jews in Shanghai were to be moved into one section of a 1 by 2.5 mile piece of the Hongqiu neighborhood. So they kind of drew the line here. And this effectively became the Shanghai ghetto. Right? They crammed everyone into this section. Betty and Edith were on Chusan Road. So right here, I don't know where exactly, but they're somewhere on here. And it became what we think of when we think of a ghetto. Right? They needed to carry their ID at all times. They had to obtain passes to travel outside of the ghetto. Aunt Betty tells a story about this guy, Mr. Goya. He was the one in charge of handing out passes for people to go to school, to go to work. And he was very, I can't think of the word that I want to use, but quick-tempered, I would say. So some days he would be really nice and hand Betty and Edith candies. Other days he would go around yelling at people, smacking people. She said he was a very short guy, so he would often hop up on his desk and start yelling at people. And he styled himself, he liked to call himself King of the Jews. So he's a little bit wacky. We'll touch back on him afterwards. He actually became a character in, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but he became a character in a musical that my aunt had a hand in. I'll discuss at the end. So the Japanese, though, while they did form the ghetto, it was pretty different from the German ghettos. The Japanese never wanted to expel or exterminate the Jews, despite their German allies telling them to. There's many correspondence between German and Japanese ambassadors where the Germans are saying, set up death camps, right? Send them back to Germany so we can do it. The Japanese were never really up for that. It's interesting. They were definitely anti-Semitic. They did not necessarily like the Jews, but they wanted to use them as part of their empire. They wanted to help kind of get them to buy into the imperial goods of Japan. And they also thought they could levy them as allies to other countries in the world. Kind of before Pearl Harbor, right after Pearl Harbor, they were already at war with the US. But before then, they said, they were thinking, if we treat the Jews well, we can go to America and say, look how well we're treating, you've got Jews in America, we have Jews here, look how well we're treating them. Why don't we continue trading? So it's kind of an interesting way that they were handling the Jews. This is Aunt Betty's but like her residence certificate. It was marked that she was Jewish. This obviously is black and white, but this is a yellow mark signifying that she was Jewish. And then here is basically the diploma for my grandmother, finishing the Shanghai Jewish school. And I just put it up here because she, all of a sudden Japanese started to get added on. Later on in their time, Betty had to drop out of school because their mother was very, very sick. And my grandmother was in her last year of school, so they decided that she should stay, finish up. Betty would stay home, take care of her mother. I think she had pneumonia, so it was very serious. She did survive that. But yeah, so this is kind of her basically diploma in the Shanghai Jewish school. So life in the ghetto. So again, they were moved to a one-room apartment on Chusan Road. This is basically their room, the bed. There might have been a little kitchenette on this side. And by kitchenette, I mean a pot with some boiling water, basically. One new thing that they had to contend with was air raids. Right at this point, the US Army has started to get close enough to make strikes on the Asiatic mainland. So they were striking Japanese positions in Shanghai. Occasionally, as we know, bombing runs go off. So there were times when a bomb would land in the ghetto or near the ghetto and kill some of its residents. There was a story about one night they heard the bombing, the planes coming in. And I guess, there wasn't a lot of entertainment. So one of the things was that they wanted to go up to the window and watch the planes go by, right? Watch the explosions happen. Remember, there wasn't any TV, so they had to find their entertainment somehow. Their dad was like, no, you go to the basement, right? We have to stay safe from these bombing runs. Begrudgingly, Betty and Edith go downstairs. When they come back up after the bombing run, they see Edith's pillow has a hole burned in it, and their window has a hole burned in it because a piece of shrapnel had blown through the window and gone right through Edith's pillow. So had they been out there watching that night, we probably wouldn't be here. Right? So just again, these little things, these little moments that happen. Movies were a big thing. They did have a cinema in the ghetto. So they would watch movies. Edith, one of my grandmother's favorite was Shirley Temple. And this also had this was a good time for their parents to get them out of the house, right? So a lot of times Max would give Edith and Betty money, say, hey, go to the cinema. Right? Most of the times they'd be like, yeah, great, that's fine. But there were some times where they didn't want to go and say, oh, there's nothing I want to see. And there's one time Max was like, no, here's some money, you can have soda, you can have candy, go to the cinema. So like, okay, so they start going. The projector breaks, so they can't go see the movie. They come back home, and Edith opens the door and finds her parents in what would be a compromising position. So I think we know why Max wanted them to go to the movies all the time. Remember, they're all sharing one room, one solid room. So Max said, don't worry, I'm just keeping mother warm. That's all that's happening. So that was a little entertainment on their side. There's also sporting events. Edith, my grandmother, actually became a ping pong champion in China, which if you know anything about the Chinese ping pong team and how they play ping pong now, I think that's miraculous. Because she was playing against both Jews and Chinese people. So, life was rough, but there are certain times, right, they still had fun, obviously going to the movies, playing ping pong, but there were certain moments that really hit and kind of brought them back to reality. So I was telling some of my classmates, I read this book when I was in middle school, and then I read it again earlier this week. So when I was in middle school, I had no idea what Theresienstadt was. I do now. Theresienstadt, for those who don't know, was the ghetto, the primary ghetto where they shipped, or where they staged people to then ship them to Auschwitz. So I'm just gonna read from her book. It's just 2 pages because I wanna get it basically from her words. Every week, we wrote letters on very thin airmail paper to our relatives back in Berlin and Czechoslovakia. For a year or two, we received no news from them, but after the war broke out, there was only silence. By this time, my parents knew that no more Jews were allowed out of Nazi-occupied countries. There was no possibility for my grandparents or any of the uncles and aunts to join us. We all hoped to see them again after the war was over. After a long time without any news, it must have been 1943 or 1944, a postcard one day came from Chusan Road, or came down to Chusan Road where they lived. It was written by my grandmother Jeanette, who we thought still lived in Berlin with my grandfather. The card came from a place called Theresienstadt. Omi, which is what she called her grandmother, Omi briefly explained that they had been resettled to a kind of work camp. Without giving any details, she wrote that she was getting along as best as she could, adding that my grandfather had died at the camp recently. I can still hear my mother screaming that day. It reminded me of a time a few years earlier when we left Berlin and she could not bear to leave her parents behind. Much later, when Mutti could talk about it, she told us that my grandfather had served with the German army in World War I. He had been stationed in a barracks in Theresienstadt and spent much of his time in the army there. Resourceful as ever, the Germans turned it into a concentration camp during the Second World War. Theresienstadt was used for propaganda purposes by the Nazis. They conducted tours for news media from different countries, showing what a model resettlement camp they had built for the benefit of the Jews. In reality, it was a work camp, using forced labor extracted from Jewish prisoners. It also served as a staging area for removal to the death camps of inmates who survived the brutal conditions there. My mother's parents and thousands of others died there. We were not aware of these events during the war years. Rumors about concentration camps and wholesale slaughter that sometimes drifted along were not believed, simply because they were so unbelievable. It was only later, when it was all over, that the incredible facts emerged. After the war ended, my father made many inquiries through the Red Cross, trying to trace the whereabouts of our relatives. Eventually, we found out that almost the whole family was wiped out. Some of them could not be traced at all and were never heard from again. Both sets of grandparents, one in Theresienstadt and the other somewhere in a Polish concentration camp, along with the uncles, the aunts, and their children, had been exterminated. A few exceptions, the cousins I had played with years ago in Czechoslovakia, with few exceptions, the cousins I had played with years ago in Czechoslovakia were gone. They died alone or together with their parents, we never knew. All we could find out was that they were transported to concentration camps in Poland. Only 3 of my father's family survived the camps. They were his brother Arthur, sister Irma, and cousin Otto. All my mother had left of hers was her sister Lisi, with us in Shanghai, and her brother Ernst, who had fled to England before the war. Tante Greta, so Tante's aunt, Tante Greta, her oldest sister, who had refused to leave my grandparents alone in Berlin, was also killed with her husband in one of the camps, probably in Poland. So Betty puts this kind of right in the middle of the book. So it kind of just, I don't know, right? It hits me. This is kind of me going off away from this and just my own. Right, there's a branch of my family tree, of our family tree, that just ends. Right, we can't really research any further back from it. So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty serious stuff. Sorry, this is where my notes would have come really handy. So I'm just gonna go. So the end of the war ends. Betty's having fun, dates with GIs. So is Edith, right? That's Aunt Betty, that's my grandmother. That is not my grandfather, I don't know who that is. But they both had jobs with the US military. Betty worked for the Navy. Grandma works for the Air Force, just as secretaries. And they're having fun. They're meeting guys. One of Edith's dates missed his shuttle back to the barracks, and she decided that he could stay the night. But my grandmother was, she was prudent. She locked him in the storage closet, and he had to sleep there for the night. So eventually, they both met their husbands. I'll go on the next page. Edith here fell in love with a good old country boy from West Virginia who came in and swooned her with his guitar. That'd be my grandfather. Betty fell in love with one of those Bolshevik White Russians that fled Russia. And the way she describes it, so he worked at the local YMCA. He was a lifeguard, a PE teacher. And when she describes in the book, I just look at it like those movies where, like the lifeguard is walking down the thing and everyone like flips up their sunglasses. Apparently Uncle Lug was a hunk. You can decide for yourself. So Aunt Betty and Uncle Lug, his name was Oleg. And they called him Lug because he had a big head. But I only knew him as Uncle Lug. And then my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandfather was in the Army. So he whisked Edith away, made her a war bride. And they came back to New Jersey. Betty and Oleg didn't quite have it as easy. Oleg being Russian, it was kind of hard for him to get to America just with how the relations after the war ended. So they went on a whole other journey. So at this point, they're gonna kind of split. Right, so this is Edith's document. Basically, the American consulate put the stamp of approval on her. She's gonna come to America with my grandfather, and they're gonna make their life in New Jersey. We'll get more on that later. So, I'm almost done. Basically, there's just lots of things that happen. So Betty and Oleg, they kind of how my great-grandfather Max was feeling like his time was running out in Germany. Oleg was kind of feeling like, Oleg and Betty were kind of feeling like their timing was running out in China. The Chinese communists were now taking over, so that was a whole new threat, right? Oleg was an anti-communist, so he was certainly scared what would happen if they discovered him. And just anti-foreign sentiment on the whole. So how Shanghai had been a city of French and American and British, even when the Japanese ruled it, that's starting to change. The communists are gonna come in and they're gonna start to expel foreigners. Oleg's mother had a friend in Australia that could sponsor them. So that was pretty much the only place that they could go. They decided to go off to Australia. While they were traveling, Betty was pregnant. I forget exactly how, but she was pretty far along. They actually, in Hong Kong, the Australian officials denied her entrance because they were worried about her like giving birth prematurely. So she and Oleg lived on a houseboat for a couple days while they were trying to figure out their situation. And lo and behold, Sir Horace Kadori, who had started these schools that she had gone to, had moved to Hong Kong. So she reached out to him, and he said he remembered her, but you know, who knows? There's a bunch of children in his schools, and he actually flew them to Sydney. So they arrived in Sydney in May 1950. While this was happening, Max and Olga, their parents, had to take a train back through to Germany. There was really no way that they could go. So they actually ended up being a displaced person in a camp in Bavaria for almost a year. And Betty doesn't really get too much into it, but I can only imagine those kinds of feelings that go through your mind, Olga and Max's mind, having to go back to Germany very recently after this trauma has happened. They eventually, after all of their paperwork gets cleared, they then join Edith and Jim, my grandparents, in New Jersey. And finally, Betty and her family, she has 2 kids at this time, they're able to make it back. They go back through Europe as well, and they're able to go in New York City. They land in 1953. When she originally wrote, she wrote the name. We landed in this airport, and I couldn't think of the name of it, and I was like, I've never heard this airport. And then she's like, now known as JFK. I'm like, oh yeah, it's 1953. It wouldn't have been called JFK back then. But it was the airport that is now JFK. And I put Coca-Cola up there because as she was waiting for her parents to come pick her up, you know, she's this woman with 2 kids, all this baggage, basically everything they own. This man comes up to her and they get to talking, and she says, this is her first day in America. So he buys them all Coca-Cola. Says, welcome to America. And she wrote, how friendly the Americans are to foreigners and to immigrants. And I had to just laugh a little bit. All right, so we're kind of ending out now. So that's Aunt Betty recreating a photo of her when she was 19. She began telling her story pretty much after her parents died. Max died in 1974, Olga died in 1987. I unfortunately did not get to meet either of them. But when that happened, she kind of realized that she was the old generation left, right? It was her story to tell. If she didn't tell it, who would know what happened? How would her kids know? How would future generations know? She had collections of stories written down, both from her family. Her father had written a diary. My grandmother had written a diary. And if you guys read the book, you can notice it's just these little stories, basically. She just kind of pieced them all together. So she went out, she wrote the book. The book was published in 1992. And then she started going to high schools, talking to students. And then her reach really spread. That's what we'll see in the next slide. Yeah, she's actually been called one of the leading people in this field of telling about the Shanghai Jews. So these are some of the things. I mentioned that Mr. Goya, after Mr. Goya, after the Japanese were defeated, Mr. Goya, the little short King of the Jews guy, he was trying to escape pretty quickly. And I don't think he was like killed, but like as he was literally running down the street, people were like throwing stuff at him and like kicking him and things like that. So he got a little bit of what was coming to him. But this is the musical that my great aunt was part of writing. This is actually a musical. It's still in development. I got to see a preview of it. Uncle Stephen, we went to it at University of Delaware. It's a very interesting story. It's about these Jewish musicians that had moved to Shanghai and taught Chinese students how to play classic violin. So it's still kind of in process. I don't know if it's gonna go or not, but it's pretty interesting. There was a documentary in 2001 called Shanghai Ghetto. Aunt Betty was one of the primary interviews for that as well. The Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C. had this exhibit in 2019 and 2020, and this was literally the poster for the exhibit. That's Betty, Edith, Max, and Olga. And then right here, the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, and I've recently just found this out, has Betty as a hologram. So you can go, you can talk to her. Yeah, I know some of our family. Uncle Stephen, have you gone?
I've seen it on my
Okay.
on video. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
My sister Holly was talking to him.
Yeah.
She would answer back.
So our Aunt Holly, they let her like kind of go before the museum opened up and talk with her. And so I'm gonna make a trip soon and go. And if you're in St. Petersburg, Florida, you can talk to Aunt Betty. And then this is just a quick video. I'm gonna stop at about 30 seconds in. But this is the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum in Shanghai. And you get to see a little bit of the original buildings that were part of Shanghai, the Shanghai Ghetto. So this is the original buildings, basically. That is Aunt Betty's wedding dress, the same one she was in the picture. So they do have that as part of their exhibit. So again, if I'm ever in Shanghai now, I need to go and view that. So I'll leave basically after this, and then I'll open up for questions. There's a chapter in the book, I believe it's chapter 9, called Anne Marie. Anne Marie was my Aunt Betty's best friend growing up. Like, they're almost like sisters. And when Aunt Betty and their family had to leave, they met at a park, they said goodbye, and that was it. So she never knew what happened to Anne Marie. Anytime Aunt Betty would do a talk, even in her Shoah interview, she mentions Anne Marie. In the book, she writes a chapter about Anne Marie. 2020, there was somebody who had listened to Aunt Betty's talk and then listened to Anne Marie's talk. She eventually moved to Chile or Argentina, somewhere, one of those two countries, and did Holocaust education there. So this person had heard both of their stories and said, wait a minute, something's matching up. So this happened in 2020.
For 82 years, these two old friends have had the same dream. Finally, it's come true. Betty Grebenshikoff and Anna Marie Berenberg were separated in Germany during the Holocaust at 9 years old.
It was a very special friendship. We are all the time together.
We said goodbye to each other and we were crying.
While they promised to stay in touch, it became impossible.
After years of not hearing or seeing anything, I thought she had died.
Betty ended up in Florida. Anna Marie settled in Chile. They built new lives, but were committed to telling others about their Holocaust remembrances. Recently, USC Shoah Foundation discovered a similarity in their stories of survival, bringing the two together for the first time in more than 80 years in a video chat.
Es wie ein Geschenk.
Das habe ich auch gesagt.
Seeing each other again, it's as if you had missed no time.
We just love one another, and it's just like an old friendship has been rekindled, and in such a miraculous way.
Now they call each other every week like best friends do.
The light in this moment for me is Betty.
Somehow, somewhere, there's a silver lining. I have found my silver lining. I'm very, very fortunate.
Friendship surviving separation, a timely lesson for all of us. Rahima Ellis, NBC News.
So I think, right, through all the sadness, that's an amazing story. Reconnecting with your best friend after 82 years. This was during COVID, right? So they did Zoom after COVID happened, after COVID died down. They actually met in person with members of their family, and yeah, reconnected. Aunt Betty said it was funny because Anna Marie didn't really speak that English very well. Aunt Betty doesn't speak Spanish, so they had to like dust off their old German and like talk in German to each other because that was their common language. So yeah, just right, tiny little things that happen like that. So that's pretty much the end of it for now. I'll leave it to questions. This is the last time I saw Aunt Betty. This was at that Shanghai Sonata preview at University of Delaware. So me, my Uncle Stephen, who's right here, some of my cousin Ryan, and my aunts and uncles, and then Aunt Betty and her daughter Jennifer. So I'll leave it open to if anyone has any questions.
Is Anne-Marie still alive? I'm sorry.
I would have to.
Is Anne-Marie still alive?
I would have to probably talk to Jennifer because I'm not sure. Yeah, Aunt Betty passed away in 2023. But yeah, I'll have to check with Jennifer to see if Anne-Marie is still alive.
Here, if you don't mind, just
Yeah. So you said you heard most of the story like growing up. So was there anything in the book that was like newer information that you hadn't heard growing up? Like anything that's stuck out?
I don't know if it was newer information, but I think it was right how I'm talking it. Now I see it through the lens of all the studying we've done on the education and the life experience. I think when I read it first time in middle school, I was I was a lot younger, so I was kind of like going on, oh yeah, it sounds fun. They went on a cruise and things like that. I say middle school, probably like 5th grade or so. But yeah, just seeing it through a different lens now at this point.
Considering when the book came out in 1992, I know you talked about some of the new stuff that also came up, but for the branch of your family that they couldn't trace back, with the advancements in technology, have any new documents or any new leads whatsoever come out to at least give some idea of what happened, or is it still totally lost?
It's still pretty lost. With advances like is it Professor Man ITS, the International Tracing Service? They still require a lot of information they're given. One of the things that we've been able to, or we're starting to work on, is her one cousin Otto, who survived. He went through 10 concentration camps. He was liberated at Bergen-Belsen, and he weighed 80 pounds when he was liberated. So kind of using that to work off of, we've been able to kind of trace his journey. But it's pretty tough if there's not somebody that can answer questions for you and put that information in.
So
Dan, when we went to Brookdale, we learned that some of the Jewish ghettos throughout Europe and in Asia, they had their own currency that they would give to the Jewish people in the camp or in the ghetto. Did you see anything like that in Shanghai in your research?
I haven't. Not saying that it wasn't there. There were just certain things that Aunt Betty didn't cover. And at this point, it's like kind of tough to be able to find it through those means. But I think in my process in doing this is that there are still a lot of other survivors from the Shanghai ghettos. So at this point, I want to kind of go into more of those stories and kind of create it. So maybe I'll find out, let you know.
I know I think it was the third to last slide, not entirely sure, but she was wearing a more traditional Chinese dress. Was there anything that she brought back to the United States that was more traditional from China or any of the other places that she was that either you guys still continue to do or that she just did even after her time, even being fully back into like a Western society?
Mm-hmm. As far as items she definitely brought back. Like I remember her house in Ventnor, going there and seeing the old china and things like that. I'll actually open up to my cousin and my uncle. Do you remember any customs or anything that she did from China?
No, no, I mean, just a regular American birthday parties and Hanukkah and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember the child, I remember did love the culture. There's aspects of the culture from Shanghai, from China, that she did bring back with her, like some of her wardrobe a little bit, and I just remember seeing it like she still had a little bit of flair that she brought with her, and she kind of brought it. You know what I mean, right?
Mm-hmm. I do remember. Oh, sorry.
I do remember that we attended what we called the rickshaw reunion, which they used to have every 2 years. Someplace in a Chinatown. They had one in Philadelphia. That's the one that I went to with my mom, Aunt Betty and Holly. And it was just more or less to thank the Chinese for letting them come into Shanghai. Now, I don't know if they still do that, but it would be generally every 2 years.
Mm-hmm. I do remember when I was a kid, me and my younger brother went to, this is going to sound funny, but we went to Disney World with my Aunt Holly and my grandmother. And, at Epcot, they have all the countries, and they do have China, and the exhibit there, I don't know if it's still this way, but you walk in, and it's like a 360 video, basically of, I think, Shanghai. And I remember, I was young, but I still remember, right, just watching my grandmother just kind of like lose herself in like a good way, kind of just like you could see she was being like transported back to it. So yeah, that's one of the memories I do have of my grandmother when I was young.
Did you read her recent, at least I've read them recently, her journals, grandmom's journals as a child, as she was writing letters to her grandmother?
I have them right here. Yeah, so what my cousin is referencing is my grandmother wrote these journals basically on the trip on the ship over there. It's cute stuff about like what they're eating, the swimming pools, but the daggers that she keeps writing to her grandmother, right, who's still back in Germany, and say, "Oh dear Omi, I can't wait to see you. I'll tell you all about this when you come." And just like everything starts like, "Omi, I'm dedicating this to you. We'll have such fun time when you're in Shanghai with us." So yeah, reading those back, it's pretty tough.
I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, going off all of that, I'm so impressed with how much she saved, from pictures to letters to, that's pretty remarkable. I don't know, if I travel, I lose everything. So, and the journey she went through, right, is just, it's unbelievable and remarkable how much was saved. And that's really amazing. I'm very interested in, of course, the Shanghai Museum. And I don't know how much you know about this, but my two questions would be, how is this established? Who runs it, right? And it seems pretty amazing and thorough telling this story. is there still a Jewish community there? I don't know if you know any of that, but that interests me a lot.
I know there is still a small Jewish community there. I don't know exactly who runs it, but I know I'm actually part of a group of Shanghai descendants on like WhatsApp, and they do have a big voice in what is put on in the museum. So I don't know actually who runs it. I don't know if it's state run or privately, but they do consult descendants of the refugees for their exhibits and things like that.
When it also seems that the curators contacted a lot of survivors to say, would you have something to donate, or if the dress is there, which is quite remarkable. So, any final? Yeah. Oh, please.
Daniel, was there any barrier with English language, or what language did they speak while they were in Shanghai?
Yeah, good question. So they did take lessons in English while they were still in Germany, because they were just trying to figure out where they were going. So when they initially were taking lessons in Spanish when they thought they were going to go to South America, that fell through. And then they figured out pretty much wherever they go, they're going to have to know English. So when they were in Shanghai, they knew English, German, they were learning Chinese. And then when the Japanese took over, they were also then learning Japanese. I don't know their level of fluency. I know my grandmother, German was her first language. So her and Betty, they both spoke with a slight German accent. But yeah, mostly German and English. Yiddish, yeah.
Yiddish. Mm-hmm. Any other final questions, comments?
When my mom and Betty got together, it was German they spoke. Yeah. So we don't know what the heck they were saying.
That's always the good thing about knowing foreign languages, right? You can.
Well, if there's any other questions, I'll be here. But thank you for joining me tonight and listening to Betty and Edith's story.
Well, I want to thank thank you again. I think it's a really, really important story, and I learned so much just from tonight that I didn't know. And also bringing light to history that typically isn't talked about, or it's not a race, but it's sort of backgrounded a lot. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about this story, and I think that that's very, very important. So once again, help me in thanking Dan for doing this.
Thank you.